Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
Hello. Thanks for joining us on Mission Evolution. We're coming to you on X-Zone TV and Simul TV from our broadcast studios in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada, bringing the latest evolutionary information from today's leading experts. This hour, we'll take a closer look at Jesus, the myth behind the man. A few stories have been the topic of much debate as much as the life of Jesus. There are as many renditions of this story as there are churches, each declaring their version to be the authentic one. Yet, with all the years of study, and today with all our scientific advancements, have we found proof that Jesus ever walked the earth in physical form? Joining us this hour from England to consider this mystery is COLM HOLLAND. COLM is the original publisher of the global bestseller, The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, and author of the Amazon #1 book, The Secret of the Alchemist, and editor of the book by the late Geoff Roberts, The True Origins of Jesus, The Myth Behind the Man, with a foreword by Dean Wilkinson. His website, colmholland.com. COLM, thanks so much for joining us on Mission Evolution.
Hi, Gwilda. It's lovely to be with you again.
It's always such a pleasure working with you. So how's the weather up there in England?
Cold.
Why doesn't that surprise me, right?
It hasn't changed since about February, but we'll any day now we should be seeing some warm weather. Thank you.
All right. So what prompted your interest in re-examining the life of Jesus?
I encountered Jesus when I was about 18 years old. And that encounter I had with Jesus, as I'll call him, revolutionized my life. Who I am today, who I was after that experience that I had in my own bedroom, was transformative completely. And to the point that I've devoted the best part of my life since trying to understand, first of all, what actually happened in that moment, but also trying to build a context around it to see what shape and form in terms of practical outliving of that experience, what that actually looked like. And of course, in the process of that, I've tried lots of different things, including various versions of Christianity that you've just described. So here I am, 70 years old, quite a few years since I was 18. And I think that, I might be older, am I any wiser? Maybe not. But one of the things I am certain of is that I have a better understanding in my own mind of what that experience was. But in addition to that, what it can actually mean for anybody who's actually searching for a deeper understanding of Christianity in general. This is a huge subject, Gwilda. I acknowledge that. I apologize in advance. We're hardly going to scrape the surface, but there are some things that I wanted to just broach on that I thought were really important for anybody who is personally seeking to understand maybe their own experience of Jesus, or trying to expand their own understanding of Christianity, the pros and the cons, and that sort of thing.
Well, hopefully we will get into it and do our best in the time that we have. So, COLM, do you consider yourself a Christian?
Yeah, in my definition.
After going through all the others, right?
So we've been through a lot, yes. This is one of the problems with religion way beyond Christianity, of course, in general, is that it really depends who you speak to and who you ask to give you a definition of what Christianity is. One of the slightly peculiar aspects of the Christian faith is that, generally speaking, the majority of versions of Christianity as you so rightly said earlier, believe that there is some truism to their particular version. And that's, I would even go so far as to say many of them believe that there's an absolutism to their particular version. So whether you speak to a very literal Bible believing evangelical on the one hand, or whether you speak to a Greek Orthodox or a Russian Orthodox believer on the other hand, and sort of everything in between, including Roman Catholicism, that generally speaking, one of the peculiar aspects of Christianity is that each has to believe, according to their Orthodox version of their faith, that theirs is the right version of Christianity.
And that's very unfortunate, really, isn't it?
It is a bit.
How many wars have we had so far up to date? Have we had over that very topic? So,
Yeah,
outside of the New Testament, is there
yeah.
any historical evidence that Jesus was ever in physical form?
Do you want the long answer or the short answer?
Kind of go in between.
Okay, no, I'll give you the short answer first. The answer is no. No, there is no what we would call historical evidence for the physical existence of a Jesus of Nazareth. There's lots of sort of word of mouth evidence. There's lots of legacy evidence. There's lots of fable evidence. There's lots of stories repeated on, down through the centuries of the existence of a Jesus of Nazareth. But if you apply hardcore academic historic research to the existence of a Jesus of Nazareth, then pretty much all scholars, whether they're Christian faith believers or not, this is one of the things that they do agree on. And if you go to a decent academic theological college of any Christian persuasion, sort of behind closed doors, don't let the congregation know this, but behind closed doors, they will admit, they have to admit, if they're going to treat it from an academic point of view, that historically, we've got plenty of evidence for other people around those eras. Even much earlier, we've got Plato, we've got Aristotle. We've got plenty of historical documentation to prove that these very important people existed, whether they're politicians, whether they're philosophers, whether they're authors, so on, except Jesus.
Isn't that fascinating?
I know. And so one of the sort of the challenges that I really, this is my main reason for coming on here today with you, Gwilda, is to say to everyone really is how prepared would you be, given your devotion to being sort of academically and correct and looking for real evidence in so many other areas of your life? If you approach your own health, your own physical health, you want to talk to somebody who's got a really good academic understanding of the human body, especially before they start cutting you up and going in and playing with things. But with our faith, this is what's sort of ironic, really. With our faith, it's almost as if we don't really want to go there in terms of academically what evidence is there. Now, what I want to also add to that challenge, how academically prepared are we to examine our faith and the basis for our faith? But are we prepared to accept that there's a possible other version of faith, and that actually, moving academia aside and historical record aside, the real original perhaps intention of the story of the life of Jesus was always ever meant to be just that. It was actually meant to be a story.
So and that an allegory or a metaphor.
A metaphor, an allegory, a myth is part, it's a new mythology. And when you examine other religions, of which there are hundreds, of course, from that era, approximately 2,000 years ago plus, there are plenty of stories of lots of different religions, all permeating around, particularly the Middle East at that time, And the shocking thing that you do discover, if you are prepared to academically, have a good look at the origins of those religions and what they believed and who was promoting them and which geographical regions they applied to, is that they probably, nearly all of them, only ever thought of them as story.
Interesting. So, how long after Jesus' purported death was the New Testament written? I mean, I know a lot of the modern day faith is built on the Bible, but how long after his death was that written?
Okay, so I was doing a bit of research earlier today, and I found this fabulous page on Wikipedia, which I will send to you, Gwilda. I don't know if you're able to add notes after the show. But I've got this fabulous, in Wikipedia, there's a page called The Development of the New Testament. I'm just having a look at it now. So the earliest writings of the story of Jesus, what the church calls its official canon, that's a church name for what we now know as the Bible, particularly the New Testament. So the New Testament canon, or the New Testament, but as we know it today, was round about the third version of documents that the church was prepared to recognize. So the first document, really, over the life of Jesus, that the church was prepared to recognize in the first century Common Era, BC Common Era, was in fact a document by a theologian who was based in Rome called Marcion. And anybody who's studied church history will know who Marcion is. And Marcion was the only story of Jesus that was around 130, 140 AD. And if you then, we've found some other documents have been discovered, other translations have been discovered from the Greek around about 170, getting closer towards 200. Suddenly, out of nowhere, we have these four stories of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And what's interesting is that before those Gospels were written, there was another Gospel that also talked about the life of Jesus, which many people have heard of, called the Gospel of Thomas. But here's how it goes. Most academic theologians will say, and many of these people are believers. These are not agnostics or atheists. These are believing Christian theologians. Will say that if you look closely at the Marcion Bible, he was later labeled by the early church as a heretic. By the way, he was sort of thrown out. But if you take a really good look at it, there's a very close similarity with the Gospel of Luke. So many of them would say that the story of Luke, which is probably one of many people's favorite stories of Luke, wasn't originated by this unknown person who we think had something to do with St. Paul, but maybe not. But it was probably an edited version of the Marcion Gospel. So we eat the first two real stories, cut a long story short, of an account of Jesus was in the first century, going into the second century, and neither of them were Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. They were the Gospel of Marcion and the Gospel of Thomas.
So I'm to understand you to say that even the first one, if we look at it this way,
Yeah.
was a good 100
100
years. 100 years after his death.
Nearly 100 years, yeah.
A lot of information gets torped in 100 years, doesn't it?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I found information can change in half an hour.
30 seconds,
You start
Well,
adding 100 years, yeah.
We're going to have to continue with this discussion on the other side of a station break. COLM and I will return shortly, so don't you go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Are you interested in evolving with the times and becoming all you can be? Don't you wish there was one place to find the latest information to help guide you through the process? I'm Gwilda Wiyaka, host of Mission Evolution Radio TV. Join me on my mission to find the latest evolutionary knowledge and tools. The guests on Mission Evolution are leading experts in a wide variety of divergent topics, including allopathic, holistic, and integrative medicine, epigenetics, enlightenment, quantum physics, meditative practices, environmental issues, spiritual evolution, trauma healing, and so much more. Mission Evolution Radio TV is aired worldwide through the X-Zone Broadcast Network, X-Zone TV Channel 32 on Simul TV. You can enjoy our archives of radio or TV shows with our compliments at www.missionevolution.org. Come see the amazing lineup of guests and topics. With more than 200 episodes to choose from, you're sure to find what you're looking for. Visit www.missionevolution.org. Hello again. This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us this hour discussing different perspectives on Jesus is COLM HOLLAND. His website, colmholland.com. Colm, we were talking about how the first writings about Jesus happened at least 100 years after his death. Do the historical facts of the life of Jesus in the four Gospels of the New Testament agree with each other?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to give you the short answer straight away. No. No, they don't. And this is a real conundrum for lots of committed Christians of all persuasions. So when you start laying out the Gospels side by side, what you soon discover is that there are certainly three versions of the story of the life of Jesus. The Gospel of St. John, of course, isn't really what they call a synoptic gospel. In other words, it's not trying to say this is what Jesus did, this is where he went, and so on. So it's not about his life. That's more of a spiritual gospel in the sense of it's in many ways more prophetic gospel as well. So yeah, they disagree with each other, even in their own versions. And one of the places that they massively disagree, believe it or not, is around the virgin birth. The virgin birth, certainly in my experience of Orthodox Christianity, is pretty much the central tenet of the Christian faith. I mean, I can quote all kinds of mainstream theologians of all persuasions who would say, and including in the Bible itself, that if Jesus wasn't born of a virgin directly, from God, then he wasn't conceived through Mary, through normal consummation, then our faith, it says, is in vain. In other words, we don't really have a Christian faith. And rather than getting to a massive explanation of I encourage people to do what I did. Just read the first parts of Matthew and Luke in particular and compare them, whether we've got wise men or we don't have wise men, whether Jesus went off to Egypt after he was born or he didn't go off to Egypt after he was born. I mean, they just vary enormously. And that also, for somebody who has been raised or has been tutored or has been preached that to believe in Jesus, properly, our faith has to be based on the fact that he was genuinely born. He was born in a place called Bethlehem, and that he was born of a virgin, and that he was actually God coming to earth. That's the whole premise of that. The fact that there is no historical evidence for that, of course, it can be ignored. I mean, you can say, well, these people knew something the historians didn't know at the time, and that's fine. But what I want to spend a bit more time, if I may, in our talk today, conversation today, is to say that at the time, even when I'm not saying that Luke wasn't telling the truth, and I'm not saying that Matthew wasn't trying to say something really important. All the gospel writers were trying to say something really really important. And what they were trying to say is that there is a reality within the human experience of an experience of God, what they, their own definitions of God at the time. But more so than that, there is this persona, if you like, that is also a reality, and that person is Jesus, the persona of Jesus. And what they were really doing, and this is going to jump us several centuries, nearly 2,000 years, to a chap called Professor Carl Jung. But what they, he's not alone in many other theologians and philosophers who say that the human psyche has a natural tendency to imagine God and to want there to be a God, and that there is a particular experience of God, and it comes, in the case of Christianity, in a person, a persona, who they call Jesus. Jesus. So this is a Jesus that is a mythological persona, and he appears, in the Christian myth and the Christian story. But the same kind of persona, appears in multiple other mythologies and stories. I mean, he's, they're not alone in this.
Well, what was interesting is the early church leaders exclude many of the writings from their early versions of the New Testament,
Yes.
even. So, in addition to nobody agreeing, we have censorship. What was the purpose behind those exclusions?
Well, we'd have to ask them, I think. I can hypothesize a bit about why they possibly did. There were hundreds of versions of the story of Jesus in those early days, those first 2 centuries, and the church, for reasons of more than, I think they sincerely wanted there to be a single version of, if there's going to be a Jesus story, can we please agree that it's this one? It's not all of these. And believe it or not, there was a conference, in the 4th century, there was a conference in Rome of all the bishops at the time, and they had to come to some kind of conclusion about which version of the Jesus story. So what we see in the New Testament is ultimately, this is the one that they were all prepared to support, which just meant that anybody who supported different versions, of which there were several, there was a whole group of Christians at the time who we now call the Gnostics, who held a very different, radical view of the New Testament and its relationship to the Old Testament. They are worth mentioning. Let me just mention that group that we now call the Gnostics. So there was a group, and these also then later were known as the Essenes, and the Essenes were the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, which in 1947 were discovered. And anybody who's a Christian who've not researched the existence of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I recommend it, because these were people writing. These were a branch of an ancient Judaic tradition, who also, in many ways, regarded themselves as Christians and would talk about Jesus as well.
Can I interrupt and ask you,
Mm.
how long after his death were those written?
Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls were being written at the time, supposedly, when Jesus existed.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
So there's not much delay there at all. So there's a coexisting version of a faith that is Christian-like at the time of the supposed existence of Jesus himself.
Interesting. Another quick question I have for you is, they say where there's smoke, there's fire. So about this time in history, all of a sudden there's all these different renditions of Christ. What was going on, do you think, if indeed this is a myth or an allegory? What do you think was going on that prompted it all to happen at that point?
Okay, I blame a guy called Zarathustra. So Zarathustra, I'm sure many of your listeners have heard of Zarathustra. So Zarathustra was a prophet that could go. Many scholars have got him dated back to 2,000 years before the supposed existence of Jesus. Some have going back much later. So just for the sake of argument, let's date him 2,000 years before. He was sort of the father of many of the religious traditions that ended up happening around, as you said, around the time that supposedly Jesus existed. Well, certainly at the beginnings of Christianity. And let me just read you this little quote. This was a Greek philosopher, Roman philosopher called Celsus, who was writing at the same time as the New Testament was written. I've changed it into modern English so we can understand it. But what he said is this: that many of the nations of the world hold doctrines. This is at his time. So he's writing at the time that the New Testament was written. Many of the nations of the world hold doctrines like those espoused by Christians. So he was saying, I've looked at Christianity and I just want to tell you this. So there is teachings of Homer. There are teachings from the Druids of Gaul. I mean, he knew about all of these different faiths. There are doctrines of Christianity and Judaism: Linus, Macius, Orpheus, Zoroaster, who was Zarathustra, the Persian Pythagoras. All of these also believe many similar doctrines to that of Christianity. In other words, and he mentions too, they even also fabricated, in his words, to use his words, the story of the virgin birth. So many of those religions also had versions of a virgin birth. So it was, in a way, Gwilda, to answer your question, really, to give you a proper answer, that at that time, certainly the world was different, and religion wasn't as we see it today. Religion was really part of life. It was part of people, and people would switch and change religions based on who they were being invaded by, which happened a lot. Who the latest fashion was, who had the most power in their society at the time. And one of the things that Marcion did, who I mentioned earlier, was he made a complete break between what he believed Christianity should be and Judaism. So he said this, and this is really radical, and this is sort of where the Gnostics sat as well. So this is a whole branch of Christianity that was cut off, that was severed from, and doesn't exist in most of our knowledge today, but it was very strong at the time, which is this: that the God of Jesus, the God that Jesus spoke about, as reported in much of the New Testament, was actually not Yahweh. Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, was what they called a local God. In other words, there was a hierarchy of gods, and that the God that Jesus was referring to was an omniscient, omnipresent God whose main conditional love. In other words, he understood what evil was, but he forgave evil because he was standing at a much higher. This God wasn't even really a he, but this God had the ability to see all things, know all things, and in the great scheme of things, wasn't about to wreak vengeance on people. He wasn't going to smite people. The God of the Old Testament, did a lot of smiting and did a lot of revenging, and counted the dead, as a result of his Yahweh's action. So for the early Gnostics and Marcion and some others, there was a different version of God even, and that's the God of the New Testament. It's some even, I've talked to modern theologians on this topic. Some even now sort of relent the fact that the Church of Constantine linked the New Testament and the Old Testament. And the reason
Now,
they did that, yeah,
let's
sorry,
just
yeah,
for our audience, the Old Testament, did it come from the Jewish
yeah, yeah,
tradition?
yeah. The Old Testament that we have in the Bible now is pretty much the old, yeah, the Jewish scriptures. A certain number, it's not the entire Torah, but it's selected, but again selected by the early Christian fathers.
Well, we're
Um,
going we're going to have to take a break. That's probably a pretty good place to break so that we can
yeah.
pick it up here on the other side. But on the other side, I would like to get deeper into. Okay, so they put together two different gods basically, and what do we have now?
Okay.
Yeah. So Colum and I will be back to continue our discussion. You stay right there. This is
Question: what is the name of the unique blend of coffee you get that has been formulated by a neurologist, a neurobiologist, and a pharmaceutical chemist? Answer: you get Beautiful Mind Coffee, a unique coffee blend that tastes great and has herbal ingredients that your brain will love, and it is not just coffee, it's brainalicious. Dr. Rathbone, Dr. Jang, and Dr. Winslow, the scientific team that created Beautiful Mind Coffee, decided to collaborate on a coffee focusing on brain health. As for those herbal ingredients found in Beautiful Mind Coffee, Dr. Rathbone, Dr. Jang, and Dr. Winslow, utilizing their combined extensive scientific research background, worked with many natural and herbal products until the exact formulation that is found in Beautiful Mind Coffee was created. With a unique scientific formula not found in any other coffee being sold or served, Beautiful Mind Coffee is the only coffee blend that contains 3 herbal ingredients found to aid in boosting your daily mental clarity and focus. Every cup of Beautiful Mind Coffee contains scientifically formulated amounts of maca root powder, green tea extract, and American ginseng, all supporting good brain health. Taking care of your brain's health now can help delay or prevent the onset of cognitive dysfunction, including dementia, Alzheimer's, and more general memory loss as you get older, just by enjoying the delicious flavor of our roasted coffee and herbal ingredients found exclusively in Beautiful Mind Coffee. Did you know that cognitive dysfunction also refers to deficits in attention, verbal and non-verbal learning, short-term and working memory, visual and auditory processing, problem solving, processing speed, and motor functioning? For more on Beautiful Mind Coffee, the 3 scientists who formulated Beautiful Mind Coffee, and more details on the 3 unique herbal ingredients in Beautiful Mind Coffee, visit www.beautifulmindcoffee.ca. Beautiful Mind Coffee is now available online at amazon.ca and amazon.com. To order Beautiful Mind Coffee, visit www.beautifulmindcoffee.ca today.
Hi there. This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. Our guest this hour is Colum Holland. His website, columholland.com. Colum, there's it's been said that the story of Jesus is actually a myth or an allegory portraying astrological events. Are you familiar with that concept?
I am, and it is another subject of which I'm not an expert. So I'm not personally a student of astrology, um, but I know enough to be able to say that if you do want to go down that route and you want to have a look at that, there are some interesting um, references within astrology, and these are also in the Bible. Uh, the main one, the big one, which a lot of people know, is that the symbol for Jesus, of course, was the fish, and that astrologers believe that we go through astrological epochs, and that these are big chunks of time, 1,000 odd years, whatever, and that Jesus was around 2,000 years ago at the time when we were going through a transition from Pisces, the epoch of Pisces, into the epoch of Aquarius, and that he was a harbinger, if you like, of that shift between the one another. So again, I'm not an expert on it, but it is not something I personally studied in any great detail, so I wouldn't dare start venturing too far down that road. But yes, so there definitely is. One of the things that I do also want to mention, if I may, and that is that we haven't mentioned two other elephants in the room from a religious point of view. One is Hinduism and one is Buddhism. So
yes, I had those on the list. So do tell us how those relate.
So welcome to my Hindu and Buddhist friends. So here I am, I self-identify as a Christian, but I, have huge respect and take and learn from, wherever I can, where I feel there is truth. One of the slightly interesting conversations I had once with somebody, a Hindu friend of mine actually, was this, why, for example, has Christianity made such little impact where Hinduism already existed, apart from the cultural strength of the already embedded religion of Hindu? In other parts of the world, Christianity steamrolled its way through, but not in Hinduism. And he came back quite succinctly, and he said, "We've already got Jesus. We don't need him. Well, we don't need a new one because we've already got one." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, Krishna." And I said, "Well, yeah, but Krishna's Krishna and Jesus is Jesus." He said, "Well, we've got our own mythology, which has got so many similarities with Jesus." And I said, "What kind of similarities?" And he said, "Well, here's just a few. I've made a note of them. According to our mythology in Hinduism, Krishna was a son of God. Jesus was supposedly a son of God. They both had adopted fathers, and guess what? They were both carpenters. They were both supposedly of some royal descent, in their own kingdom. True. And guess what? In both stories, there are wise men, shepherds, and a star that occurs at the time of their birth. What a coincidence. They both spent time in the wilderness. They're both associated with some form of resurrection. They performed miracles and healed lepers. They both raised the dead. They both claimed a miraculous birth. They both taught forgiveness. And they both spent time in their mythological hell. So I said, "Well, that's fine." He said, "Yeah, it is. Just one catch, though. And that is that the mythology of Krishna was around several hundred years before the mythology of Jesus."
Interesting. Just a couple hundred years. I thought it would have been longer than that.
In a defined form, again, because various forms of Hinduism, various mythologies coming together. But they were certainly, all of those that I've just mentioned, you could pinpoint somewhere in Hinduism at least 200 or 300 years before the supposed existence of Christ. And then, so that's my Hindu friends. But now let's just have a quick chat to our Buddhist friends. Sadly, he's now passed, but I did make a friendship with a guy who was one of the world's leading Sanskrit scholars. In other words, he was a translator of ancient Sanskrit, and he was actually Danish. He was an academic. He was a lecturer at the university in Denmark, and he had no religious persuasion at all in any way. He was just fascinated with ancient Indian texts, which were very closely aligned to Buddhism, of course. and he would translate them. And he said he was asked by a monastery to translate some newly discovered but really old texts of some relatively well-known Buddhist writings. And he said he would have a look at them. And as he began to translate them, he said there was a strange familiarity. And he said, well, I'm not, but he couldn't pinpoint it. Why does this text feel really familiar? Passages within the text that he felt, I'm sure I've read this before, but I've not read it in any Buddhist text before, but I've read this. Anyway, cut a long story short, he decided to go to the Bible, to the New Testament. And he said, sure enough, it was the last place I ever expected to find them. Martha, Mary, the raising of Lazarus, the Sea of Galilee, the fishermen. He said it was all there, and this predated by again several centuries before Christ.
Amazing.
So it really got him, and he actually went and learned to read original Greek, and he lectured to Christian theologians in Denmark who were holding a conference on a subject called Q. Now, the word Q in German means source. And there is this theological belief within Orthodox Christianity, which is that lots of the sayings of Jesus are common across all the Gospels. So the one thing the Gospels do agree on is love your enemies, do good to those who hurt you, all what we call the Beatitudes, pretty much, both in Matthew and Luke in particular. And there's strong theological evidence that these particular sayings came from another source, from what they call Q, an original source. My friend Christian Lindner, Professor Christian Lindner, he went the whole hog and he said, yeah, I'll tell you where they came from.
That was going to be my next question, of course.
They came from Buddhism. It's not original to Christianity. And he said, there's no harm in that. He said, I'm not, it doesn't diminish them in any ways. And this brings me to my main point, that when we ask these questions, Gwilda, when we are prepared to be open-minded and to examine origins of Christianity, the sources of Christianity, the real roots of the New Testament, and so on, then we are potentially on the verge of something which I think is more meaningful and can be more transformative than even what most of us believe is Orthodox Christianity. And I'm going to tell you a little story that most people don't know, even though there was a movie made about it. And that is the very famous Reverend Billy Graham, who is well known to all the people in the world of the Southern Baptist world, most of whom take the Bible absolutely literally. When he went to theological college during a period of time, he started to discover all the things that I've just been talking about.
Interesting.
He had good academic Bible historians and Bible theologians who were prepared to be honest and say, academically, this is, and he had quite a crisis of faith. And he used to work with another preacher who had the same crisis of faith about the same time. And that particular preacher just fell away. He said, I just can't preach the literal version of Christianity anymore. And Billy Graham sat down, and I've got a great little addition to this story. He sat down with a couple of people who helped him significantly come to terms. And what he decided was this, that everything that I've just been talking about may be true. But does it change faith? Does it change belief? Does it change the workings of the human psyche when it comes to the process of personal transformation? And if anybody preached personal transformation, it was Dr. Billy Graham. His version of being born again wasn't just some wishy-washy, I might start thinking about Jesus occasionally. Oh, no. I mean, Billy Graham's version of Christianity was a real evidential transformation of a life, of somebody's life.
So
from the inside out.
do you believe that by trying to take it literally or having these fairly, I don't want to say dogmatic, but you get the idea, locked down
Mm,
viewpoints of it being a
mm,
physical event, et cetera, et cetera, do you
mm.
think we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater in that there's a lot of transformational information that we're losing when we try to think of it as a physical or literal event?
So the answer to that is both yes and no. So let me cover the yes and the no. So yes, if I'm going to have to call in Professor Carl Jung. I'm sorry. I know a lot of people don't particularly adhere to his philosophy on faith, but I am going to bring, because it just helps explain a few things. Um, Not that I'm a 100% supporter of what he taught, by the way, but I will say this: one of the great things that I think Carl Jung identified was this, that the human psyche has the ability to not only create story and mythology, but then to go another step further, it has the ability to adopt it as if it is real. And that's common across all the human species. It's irrelevant what culture they're from. In other words, there comes a point when we don't question what he would call the mythology or the stories that we believe. We accept them. And whether they're, I don't know, I guess in earlier days before the world of science and the Reformation and that whole period 400 odd years ago, when academia came up out of learning and universities and so on, continuation of Greek and Roman learning, was that the world was quite happy. Humans in general were quite happy to believe the stories they were told. And they were prepared to base their lives on them. They were prepared to make decisions, obey certain rules, live their life in a particular way based on their belief in those stories. Now, what I will say is this, that Carl Jung would say that actually that is possibly a really good thing for mental health, for the human mind, to actually believe those things and to follow those things.
At least gives us some
Um,
stability, which
it-
is
yes,
really being challenged by our
yes.
information-rich world right now, isn't it?
So a Christian who is prepared to accept the literal version of the New Testament and to base their life on it without doubts, without questioning, that's, Carl Jung would say, that is the psyche doing its job, and that's fine. When it becomes not fine, is two ways it becomes not fine. One is, and this is for the individual, by the way, that it's not is when you can no longer do that in all good intellectual conscience. In other words, when you begin to find there is a gap between your intellectual life and your faith life,
Then we
and
have a problem. We're going
then
to
you've
have
got an internal problem.
right.
Yes,
We're
yeah.
going to have to pick up on that thread on the other side of a station break. So please stay with us as Colm and I will continue to explore the history of Jesus. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Do you have a product or service you'd like to promote to a worldwide audience? Imagine your product featured on Mission Evolution Radio TV. If you're interested in showcasing your work, Mission Evolution is broadcast to the X-Zone TV Channel 32 Simul TV on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, YouTube, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Audible, and many other audio and social media platforms. Our professional studios can produce and broadcast your custom high-quality ad. It will be permanently embedded in each episode and featured in the archives for years to come. Together, we can make it happen. Contact us at info@missionevolution.org for more details. Spaces are limited, so don't miss out on this great opportunity. Email info@missionevolution.org today. Welcome back. This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. This hour, our expert guest is COLM Holland. His website, colmholland.com. Colm, have we covered the mystery religions and what those are?
No, we haven't really. Although I did mention them briefly. In that last session, I did say that there were various. Remember Celsus at the time said they're all, Zarathustra was one of the key ones. Then there's the Mithras religion. There were competing religions at the time of Jesus, for sure. Just about Zarathustra, for example, I'll just read you this quickly. This is by quite an expert guy. Zarathustra is probably the most important person recorded in the history of religion, bar none. He was the first man to promulgate a divinely revealed religion. Now, at the time of Christ, Zarathustranism was still really strong. It was probably pre-Christianity one of the top religions of the time, and what he taught influenced the religions of Judaism. He influenced Christianity. He even influenced Mithraism, Islam, Northern Buddhism, and so on, even the pagan Nordic religions. So the least talked about, least actually taught religion of that era, we don't even know about today. It's just not covered. So it had a much wider and greater influence than Christianity at the time. And so when you dig into what he taught, and also the other faiths that were influenced by him, the mystery religions in particular, what you discover is that they all bear many of the same characteristics. So a lot of the experiences of Jesus, a lot of the teachings of Jesus are mirrored in all of those. So a death, a violent death, a resurrection, a virgin birth, teaching and healing, miracles, all of the things I mentioned earlier, they're repeated throughout many of these. It just so happens in our culture, and again, this has got historical basis to it. So just a quick little bit history of Christianity after Jesus, and why it's important to almost sort of stand back retrospectively and look back down through the centuries to when Jesus supposedly existed, but certainly when the beginnings of Christianity existed. Certain things happened that meant that you and I in our cultures are surrounded predominantly with Christian belief. And that is mostly because of two groups of people, the Hellenistic Jews, who were Jews that were influenced by the Greek culture, but also the Roman Empire. We wouldn't have the Christianity that people believe today if it hadn't been for the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire decided, which I won't go into, to adopt Christianity as the official religion, and then continue to conquer vast swathes of the Mediterranean and Northern Europe, that was really the way that our faith was spread with the sword. Okay, so there were Anglo-Saxons in Britain and in Northern Europe as well who were Christians at the time, but the Roman version of Christianity was implanted by predominantly invasion.
And isn't that ironic, given the teachings?
So we can't ignore that. And then if you follow through, so the Roman Church in particular, as far as Britain and America are concerned, that was the big dominant faith until the period of the Reformation in the 16th century in Britain and Europe, and then the exodus of the Pilgrim Fathers from Europe and Britain, just down the road from where I live, Plymouth. They got on their ships and set off for the New World, and where they said, well, we're not going to be bound any longer by the Roman faith. We've got our own Reformed faith, and we're going to, and that's what happened in the US. So that became the dominant faith version of Christianity. So our version of Christianity that culturally we've grown up in or we've converted to has got historical roots. So to not know all of that, sitting in the 21st century, labeling oneself as a Christian, is really to just deny your heritage, to deny. So that's okay. We can go to church on Sunday, we can read our Bible, we can listen to great preachers and all, and that's all fine. As long as we're prepared to, Carl Jung would say, as long as you're prepared to throw in your entire psyche with that, then that's, generally speaking, that can lead to real benefit for your mental well-being or your psychic well-being. The problem begins to happen when, as I said in the end of our last session, when we begin to doubt that. So at the point that our intellect begins to question, we do have a choice. The choice Billy Graham made was, he said, the Christian myth is so powerful that I'm not going to call it a myth. I'm going to teach it as if it's literally true. And I think there's power in that. And he was right. I mean, he single-handedly pretty much established the evangelical Christian faith as we know it in the USA today. He and a few other guys, and their legacy, is what we see now in so many parts of the US completely, and that's fine. But what Carl Jung would say, as well as saying that's fine for the individual, there is also a chance that that individual is missing out on something. And what that potentially the individual is missing out on is actually a deeper transformational experience. And my problem was, at the age of 18, I genuinely had a really mystical, deep, transformational experience of Jesus. It didn't seem to have anything to do with the Bible. He was as real as I'm talking to you, as far as my psyche was concerned. The overwhelming sense of love and unconditional love made me a different person. And I discovered myself, and I threw myself wholeheartedly into the Christian faith. The problem I had over the years and decades, I'm talking decades, of throwing myself wholeheartedly into that, and there may be listeners out there right now hearing me and going, well, yeah, I'm kind of with you here on this column, which was that my inner experience of Jesus gradually distanced itself from the Christianity that I was being taught and that I was seeing represented in all different versions of the church. So my problem was not with Jesus. The problem I was experiencing was with the outward manifestation as represented by his church in all its various forms, which I won't go into because it's going to vary significantly. It's a personal thing that that gap between my experience of Jesus, except this, that still I was able to hold on to an experience of Jesus that only made sense once I began to read Carl Jung. And that in my book, The Secret of the Alchemist, that's really what I'm talking about there, which was again re-expressed in recent times in the book The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, which is just in a nutshell, which is that our experience of Christ, Jesus, is something which Carl Jung called the realization of the self. That there is what he called archetypes in the psyche, and that one of those archetypes is represented in the persona of Jesus. And one of the reasons Carl Jung was so keen to try and explain this to Christians was this. He said, you have a very, very, very powerful myth. The myth of Jesus is extremely transformative, but you're going to miss out on its real transformational power. And it's only when I began to realize that St. Paul and others did actually talk about this, and this is another reason why the Christian myth is so strong, is when he began to say, it's the Christ within. It's Jesus in you, said St. Paul, who is the hope of glory. In other words, there is an inner ability of the psyche, whether it experiences this in the persona of Jesus, or whether it experiences it in the persona of Krishna, or whether it experiences it in the persona of Buddha. Carl Jung would say, some have got more value than others. I'm not going to say which, but he would say some have got more value than others to particular individuals. But essentially, what you're discovering when you discover Jesus is the divine within.
Beautiful.
And that Jesus is a persona of the divine within. And that's what the transformation is. So it took me, I hope it doesn't take other people as long as it took me, but it took me a long time for that penny to drop.
Well, Colm, it's that time in the program when I have to ask you, what is your mission?
My mission is that everybody can find the divine within, and whatever I can do to help people discover that, then I feel I've fulfilled my mission.
It's a very worthy mission. When we're looking, at the evidence that indicates that Jesus was never alive physically, yet from what you're saying, each one of us can be the life of Christ because it comes from within. Is that an accurate summary of what we were saying here?
Yes, that's the power of the mythology of Jesus. Yes, absolutely. That the supposed experience of Jesus on earth can also be inner experiences within our own psyche. The death and the resurrection is by far the best example. So there is an inner death of the ego and a resurrection that comes out of the unconscious, which is the self. So the death of the ego, a rebirth of the coming together of the consciousness and unconscious, which is the birth of the self. That's one of the reasons why Christianity is so powerful, because it encapsulates that inner truth. And the reason why I call it the inner truth is that the same experience is also possible to anybody believing in the Hindu faith or the Buddhist faith or Judaism and lots of other faiths as well. So it's not unique to Christianity, except Christianity is culturally the background that we've grown up in. So it makes more sense to us.
We're about out of time, but do you think that the story of the life of Christ is actually a mapping of our process as we come into this self-realization?
Yeah, Carl Jung called it individuation, which he said the psyche is going to do anyway, whether you join in with it or you don't join in with it. The psyche wants to reach a point of what he called wholeness. And if it's one thing that all religion and people with no religion who want to see the full benefit of self-realization, as Jung called it, then it has to be wholeness.
Beautiful.
The pursuit of wholeness, yes.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. Colm, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you, Gwilda.
It's been a real pleasure. Our guest this hour has been publisher, editor, and author COLM Holland. We've been discussing the book by the late Geoff Roberts, The Origins of Jesus, The Myth Behind the Man. COLM's website, colmholland.com. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy past archived episodes, visit www.missionevolution.org. Please be sure to join us right here next time, as this mission will continue, bringing information, and resources to evolving world.